70 years after the fatal Balfour Declaration, 40 years after the UN partition plan, 20 years after the Six-Day War, 5 years after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, at the end of 1987, the Palestinian people living under Zionist occupation have created a new era in their history, a turning point in the struggle for their national rights. Their courage and their determination to assert their right to freedom from Israeli domination have altered the map. Nothing will return to what it once was. Jerusalem, holy city of Christians, Muslims and Jews, is the heart of Palestine. Palestine is the bridge connecting 3 continents, Africa, Asia and Europe. It is the center of the Arab world, a link between East and West. The Palestinians are descendants of the Canaanites, the Aramites and the Arabs. Palestine was invaded by the Persians, the Greek, the Romans, the Crusaders and the Turks before the British Empire established mandatory rule in Palestine in 1920. At that time, 8% of the population were Jewish and possessed 2.5% of the Palestinian land. In 1936, the number of Jewish immigrants had risen to 380,000, almost 30% of the population. As early as 1921, the Zionist Commission had been quite blunt in stating, there can be only one national home in Palestine, a Jewish one, and no equality in the partnership between Jews and Arabs, but Jewish predominance as soon as the number of that race has sufficiently increased. In 1947, the United Nations planned the partition of Palestine in an Arab and a Jewish state, assigning 40% of the Palestinian land to 1.3 million Arabs and 60% to 500,000 Jews. The Arab population mobilized in protest against partition, but whereas mandate authorities encouraged the constitution of Zionist paramilitary organizations, they severely suppressed Arab political activity. The very idea of partition was abhorrent to the Arabs of Palestine. They had fought their bitter and costly fight in the years 1937 and 1939. And although the Zionists had by now 100,000 potential soldiers out of a population of 500,000, the Arab villages resisted with the defiance of desperation. Soon after the UN vote, the British announced their withdrawal from Palestine As the British moved out, the Zionists moved in to occupy their new territory, and David Ben-Gurion declared on May 15th in 1948 the establishment of the State of Israel. The following day, the Zionist gangs assaulted Palestinian villages, demolished houses, leaving behind an inferno of raging flames and endless explosions, and a population who fled in panic. The inhabitants of Jaffa, Jerusalem, Haifa, Acre, Safad, and hundreds of small towns and villages, 650,000 women, children, and men became refugees in their own country. 4/5 of the new state was to comprise land abandoned by the Palestinians who fled from massacres. Half of the citrus fruit plantations, a third of all buildings, shops and stores, all confiscated as absentee property, were handed over to Jewish immigrants arriving from Europe and to more than 500,000 Jews imported from Arab countries to colonize Palestine. From the very beginning, the Zionist state was designed with expansionist territorial ambition. Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria and Egypt as part of the Promised Land. Part of this logic was Israel's attack on Egypt, Syria and Jordan in June 1967, which ended with the defeat of 3 Arab armies, the occupation of large areas of Syria and Egypt, and the rest of Palestine. When Jerusalem fell, peace was killed on the soil of peace, and war settled down. In the June 67 war, a new refugee problem was created. Roughly 250,000 people fled during and just after the war. Thus, the West Bank population was reduced substantially, and so the physical dispersal of Palestinian Arabs was all the more intensified. The personal tragedies of homelessness and torn apart families have been compounded by the brutal reality of Israeli military occupation for those who did not flee. Jaffa and Haifa, once jewels of the Mediterranean, fall apart. More than half of the total area of West Bank and Gaza were confiscated. Jewish settlers began to colonize Arab cities to submerge the national identity of Palestinians who remained and to create a sense of alienation among the younger generation. Creeping annexation of the West Bank and Gaza, the destruction of agricultural land and of the Arab economic and social infrastructure led to the dependence on the Israeli economy. The Arab workforce became a pool of cheap and exploited labor, especially in construction industry, services, small factories and agriculture. Wages are half of what Israeli workers earn. For Israel, holding on to the territories makes sense economically. Since 1967, Israel has, in violation of the Geneva Conventions, seized more than 53 of West Bank land from 800,000 Palestinian inhabitants for the benefit of 50,000 Jewish settlers. A clear line demarcates Arab land from settlement land because of the water, which is a vital element to the traditional agricultural economy of the Palestinians. For many farmers, confiscation of water and the destruction of ancestral irrigation systems put an end to their existence as peasants. Arab farmers have access to only 1% of the total water supplies for irrigation.
This is the land of our ancestors, and you, and your children, and your grandchildren must insist to stay in this land, on this soil. Don't let yourselves be driven away. Don't give in to leave even a handful of earth. You and your descendants have to continue to replant the olive trees that they destroyed and stole from us. You must teach your children and your grandchildren that this soil is our history, our blood. It is the essence of our existence.
Ever since on March 30th in 1976, the Israeli army killed and wounded dozens of Palestinian farmers who protested against land confiscations and the destruction of their olive trees, that day is celebrated as the Land Day, as a national struggle day against occupation. The central problem for Arab Palestinians is the loss of land. In the Galilee area of northern Palestine, the Arabs are 50% of the population, but own only 8 to 10% of the land.
Our people have once more proved today, on Land Day, their high sense of responsibility towards our history and their devotion to consolidate national unity in order to defeat all attempts to annihilate our people, to erase our existence from the map of the land of our ancestors.
Since the West Bank and Gaza was first overrun by Israel's army in 1967, a generation of Palestinians has grown up under the domination of occupation troops. 2 out of 3 are born after 1967. For them, history lives in the tales of the older generation. To conserve the continuity of cultural traditions as a part of national identity, the popular organizations stress on the cultivation of the social and cultural heritage of the Palestinian people. Face to face with an occupation army that attempts to annihilate the Arab population, culture becomes an element of resistance. The system of military rule in the occupied territories is characterized by constant infringement of elementary, universally recognized human rights. The constant fear and humiliation of human dignity, beatings during searches, restriction of freedom of speech and movement, as well as the increasing number of deportations, grate hard against the Palestinian self-esteem. Israeli soldiers and border police can enter Arab homes without a warrant. The number of prisons in Israel are 22, 9 of which are in the occupied territories. The number of Palestinian political prisoners is close to 8,000. Overcrowded prisons and the way detainees are treated during interrogation has come under scrutiny in reports of the Israeli press on torture methods. The report reveals also how the Israeli authorities violate basic human and legal rights of Palestinian minors during their imprisonment. It reveals how Palestinian children are subjected to arbitrary arrest, are kept in solitary confinement, tortured and humiliated, and are denied due process within the military court system. Most of these prisoners are 12 to 14 years old. Many children are tortured into confessions for acts they never committed in order to stop beatings and physical abuse by their military interrogators. The confessions are written in Hebrew, which the children do not understand. They discover only in military court what they have confessed when the confession is presented as evidence. Armed settlers are frequently invited by the occupation army to join in with the soldiers in the repression and terror against Palestinians. The use of physical abuse and torture is an institutionalized method used by the Israeli government to contain and control the population of the occupied territories and is officially acknowledged and sanctioned by the Israeli government. The tear gas used by the Israeli army caused a number of deaths of suffocation, toxic collapse, paralysis of respiratory functions, as well as ulcers and open skin sores. In Gaza, there is a 900% increase in miscarriages, attributed to psychological pressure, effect of beatings, and heavy use of tear gas. Although the use of violence by the occupation forces against the Palestinians has been steadily increasing, an alarming number of homes have been demolished. Freedom of expression and association have been primary targets to restrict and punish people for their political activities. In spite of all that repression, the popular uprising could not be stopped. It is developing in a long-term resistance movement against occupation. There is no more fear. The struggle shall continue until the end of Israeli occupation, the recovery of Palestinian lands, and the right to self-determination and to an independent state of Palestine.